This is the Garden of English. I'm Tim Freitas, and today we're going to begin poetry, and we're going to start by breaking down the prompt. So let's do this. Today's the day we start poetry. And once again, we are going to break down the prompt here together today because that's going to help us to access poetry or the poem that we're supposed to analyze in either our AP Lit class, on our AP Lit exam, or just in general. If you're given a prompt, if you know how to break down a prompt, it's going to help you access a poem. And that's important because poetry can be extremely hard due to its highly concentrated nature, due to the amount of experience that you're supposed to have with a poem that's different than with prose, and all of the patterns and forms that kind of come in. So if we actually just look at how to break down the prompt, it's going to give us an easier access to how to actually deal with the poem itself. So I am going to just shrink up here, and you are going to notice that I actually have some homemade questions here. These are Garden of English Productions here for the poem Ozymandias. But please note that I am actually looking at two different versions of Ozymandias. One of them is by Percy Shelley, and the other one is by Horace Smith. And these were written at the same time. One was actually published, I think, just a few weeks after the other. And they were in agreement that they were going to write the same poem about the same set of ancient ruins with the same kind of themes, but they were going to do it their own way. And they did. So please note that you can access these Ozymandias poems here on Teachers Pay Teachers. You can actually access them for free just right down below, and you can access them for free on the Garden of English website as well. So however you want to access that, feel free to do so. But I am going to actually, over the next few videos, deal with the Percy Shelley version of Ozymandias as opposed to the Horace Smith, although maybe we'll get the Horace Smith into the video that I do with a colleague of mine that talks about just ways to access poetry. But this right here is actually looking at poetry in relation to question 1 on the AP Lit exam, and how to break down the prompt. So these are the prompts. This is the prompt that I'm going to use. It's going to be in relation to this question. So all of my other question 1 videos that talk about thesis statements and topic sentences and body paragraphs and conclusions, those will be based around this first particular prompt. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I want to just show you that we have these here, but I'm going to pull up a Google Doc, which will also be linked down below, because this doc actually contains the written out steps of how to break down a poetry prompt so that it will make it easier for you to read the poem and understand at least what you're reading for, because that's going to make things much, much easier. So there are basically 4 steps for this. However, I'm not going to read this word for word for you. I'm going to actually just go through my little organizer and demonstrate what I've done. Please note that this document is also found right down below, so feel free to access that there. This is a Google Doc, so you should be able to pull it up and change it however you would like. Please also note, however, that I did also break down the second Ozymandias prompt, but I'm not going to go over that in this video, but it's the same exact steps. So please just note such things because the prompts are actually a little bit different. But we're going to use this first one, so we're going to zoom in here just a little bit. Let me just take care of that. Good. A little bit too much there. And I'll read the prompt, and then we'll go over the steps on how to break this down so that you can have an easier way of accessing a poem that's probably a little bit harder to read. So here we go. In Percy Bysshe Shelley's sonnet Ozymandias, published in 1818, the speaker reflects on a meeting with a traveler where the traveler recounts his observations of some ancient ruins. Read the poem carefully. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze how Shelley uses literary elements and techniques to explore the complex relationship between power, pride, and the passing of time. In your response, you should do the following. Respond to the prompt with a thesis that presents a defensible interpretation. Select and use evidence to support your line of reasoning. Explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning, and use appropriate grammar and punctuation in communicating your argument. Now, I'd like to just point out that this language that I'm highlighting on the screen right now is the same in every poetry prompt, and so you don't need to actually read these directions every time. I would like to just point out one part here, though, that's incredibly important. It says, respond with a thesis that presents a defensible interpretation. So notice that does not say a correct interpretation. It says a defensible interpretation. So, although there might be a correct message that this poem is indeed projecting, if you are off just a little bit, as long as it is indeed defensible and arguably correct, you're going to be just fine, because basically literature is highly interpretive. Now, that doesn't mean that you can say that any piece of literature says whatever you want. However, a lot of literature can be open to elements of interpretation, and therefore you want to just make sure that your interpretation is defensible. So are there times when literature, yes, this is what the author intended to do and this is what the author means? Yes, of course, right? But are there other times where things are left purposely ambiguous so you can interpret it your own way? Yes, of course. And you sometimes bring your own insights and emotional baggage and character to an interpretation that other people don't? Yes, of course. And as long as it's defensible, we're good. I used to tell my students, especially when I was a new teacher, if they'd ask questions about things where I was like, well, I'm not sure that's right, but I always just tell them, if you can write an essay about it, then we're going to just give you the okay on that interpretation. And that's kind of like what's going on here. So just a heads up on that. But anyway, let's actually talk about breaking down the prompt, because there are steps. In fact, there are 4 steps, and they're very, very easy. And most of them can be done just by reading the prompt correctly. But here we go. The first step is going to actually be filling in this column all the way here to the left. This is your tag column, and this tag column here just asks for you to figure out who the title is, who the author is, and what the genre is, okay? So if I were to go in here, okay, I could actually just pull most of this information from right in here. Now, I don't have my students actually fill these types of charts out on their AP exam. I tell them to just mark up the prompt itself, but because we've got time to practice, it's nice to fill this out in boxes here, because it helps visualize all that we have to take care of, and it helps us put things together when we have a thesis template. So anyway, our title is Ozymandias here. And then we have our author, and that right now is Shelley. And then our genre I put here as poem. But if you actually notice, it actually calls it a sonnet in the prompt itself. So I'm going to actually put the word sonnet here. Now, notice that we did read the prompt, but we did not read the poem yet. And that's purposeful, because we want to break down the prompt first, because the more we can glean from the prompt, the easier it will be to interpret the poem. Okay? So once we actually figure out our title, author, and genre, we want to go back to the prompt, and we want to get some exposition, whether for the poem itself or for the poet. If we talk about, background information about the poet, then perhaps we're talking more about exigence and context. That's okay. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to just say, in this column right here, what's background information that we can pull, whether about the poem or the poet or anything of that nature. So you'll notice that I went in here, I reread it, and these are the types of things that I picked out. First of all, I put that it was published in 1818. Now, this is important because this is kind of the beginning of the Romantic era in literature, and we're kind of breaking from that age of reason that kind of came before it. And the reason why that date is so important is because if we know anything about the Romantic era and the Romantic poets, we could start potentially, considering some of the messages that are going to come out through the poem. Now, that doesn't guarantee that the date has everything to do with our interpretation, but if we know a little bit about literary time periods, this is going to help, particularly in relation to how Romantics see art. And we'll talk about that when we actually read the poem and interpret it later on in a couple videos from now. I did put that it was marked that this was a sonnet, so it's not just a poem, it's a sonnet, okay? Please note, though, this sonnet structure is actually, it does deviate from the norm just a little bit. We also want to recognize here that our speaker of our poem is recounting the observations of someone else. This is important because right off the bat, that's going to tell us that it establishes a frame narrative, and that gives us some background information right away, because the frame narrative actually has 2 purposes. One, it helps to establish more exposition, and it also works to separate. And so now we could start saying to ourselves, when I read this poem, what's the kind of background information that might actually be clarified through the frame narrative? And it also makes us want to ask the question, why is it important that there be some element of separation between the story and the listener? And typically there's a purpose for that. So right off the bat, we now have something to actually look to in terms of a lit technique. So that's something to think about. But we also get this clarified because it does tell us that the traveler who's recounting or who's observing something, these observations are about ancient ruins. So now we know that we are looking at ancient ruins, so that when we read this poem, And I'm like, wait a second, what is he looking at? No, it's ancient ruins. And we need to just figure out what those ancient ruins are. Okay. And then if we read the prompt in full near the very end, we also find out that this poem itself is about power, authority, and time. Now, these are really cool words to use because they are abstract. So that means that they are universal ideas, or you might know of them as thematic topics. Now, these aren't thematic insights yet. We're going to create universal insights. But the thematic topic or the universal topics or ideas are listed out here. So it's like, okay, now I've got a poem about power, authority, and time, and now I need to kind of figure out and glean what the message is about that. Okay. So that's our second step. We take care of our tag. We then find our elements of exposition and background, context and exigence if you want. For this column here, I'm going to just write that there. And so now what's going to happen is this. We're going to spread this out too. Sorry for formatting while on screen, but that's okay. We then want to break down what's called our command and our conquer. Okay, and you'll notice that this is the same thing I do with every other prompt. And the command always starts with the same word every single time. It's super easy, and it's the word analyze. So we would go from analyze all the way to the end of the sentence. That's what we are commanded to do in the essay that we write. It doesn't say describe, it doesn't say explain, it doesn't say summarize, it says analyze. So we need to make sure that we do that. So we want to know what analyze means. Analysis actually has 3 parts. And if you know these 3 parts, it actually works out nicely because these are the 3 parts of, they make up the 3 movements of a body paragraph that you write. So when you analyze something, you're going to identify what and why. And that's what you're going to do in your topic sentence, right? When you analyze why your car broke down, you're like, okay, what's wrong and why is it not working, right? Well, our topic sentences are going to do the same thing. They're going to identify what the author is doing and what the poet is doing and why the poet is doing it. So that's our first part of our analysis. But analysis then breaks down where something is seen. So that's the second step of analysis. And that's what we need to do in our body paragraphs. We break down where that what we talked about is actually seen. And then the last thing is part of analysis is you explain how. And so because analysis has 3 parts, the identify, break down, and explain, you want your body paragraph to follow that same mold. Identify what the author's doing and why the author's doing it, break down where it's seen in the text, and then explain how that area in the text actually conveys the why that you mentioned in the topic sentence. And if you can do that with all your body paragraphs, you're going to be in really decent shape into writing a good, strong, analytical essay. So that's why it's important to get that word analyze there in the forefront of our mind. But the other reason why it's important to find this command is because it's going to actually help us create what we call the conquer question. And this right here is your access point to the poem. This will allow you to know exactly what you're reading for. So we've got this conquer question. It's going to allow you to conquer reading the poem and conquer writing about it. And so what we do here is we go to our command and we find the infinitive, which is to and then a verb. So in this case, it's to explore. A lot of times it's to convey or to develop or to portray, something along those lines. In this case, it's to explore. And what we want to do is we want to actually go in here and we want to look at only from the infinitive to the end of the sentence. And we want to say, what can't we know? And we want the word to start with what, because that's a much easier question to answer than why or how. And so we want to do these what elements here. And we're going to say, what can't we know? And I say, okay, do I know this poem is about time? Yep. Do I know it's about the passing of time? Yep. Do I know it's about pride? So notice I'm just pointing at it. I'm just moving my cursor over every word and saying, do I know this poem is about this shit? Yep. Do I know it's about power? Yes, I do. Okay, do I know this poem is exploring something? You better believe it. Do I know what the complex relationship is between these things yet, though? And the answer to that question is no. And so because of that, I create this question, right? What is the complex relationship between power, pride, and the passing of time? And that is what I ultimately have to be able to answer when I'm done reading this poem. What is the complex relationship between these ideas according to this poem? And you'll notice that I've got this column to the right. Now, we haven't read the poem yet, but now I know what I'm reading it for. I'm reading it for this complex relationship. And what you do is this right-hand column, we're not going to fill this in because we haven't read the poem yet. We can fill it in after. But what you do is you actually answer this question in relation to what does it seem to suggest in the text, right, about characters in the text or events in the text when it comes to this relationship between power, pride, and the passing of time. And then we also want to say, okay, in a universal sense, that means not talking about the characters in the story, not naming the events that happen in the poem or the story. What can I say is universally true about these ideas? Now, we're not going to get into that yet. We'll get into that in our next video when we actually talk about putting together thesis statements. But to break down the prompt, it's really important to get to this question, because now I know exactly what I'm reading for. And I also know that to write a strong thesis that's going to create a line of reasoning, I have to answer this question. I can't just say the author does A, B, C, or D in order to create or convey the complex relationship between power, pride, and the passing of time. I need to identify what that complex relationship is, and that's what I'm reading for. So that's what you're looking to do as you break down your poetry prompt in AP Lit or any poetry prompt. You can probably turn it into a what question, even if you're looking at just a prompt that you just get in a general class. That's fine too. If this video was helpful, I'm going to always ask that you like and subscribe, because that's the easiest way to actually help out the Garden of English. I also want to just point out that we actually started a new set on Patreon, where we have different ways that you can donate to the Garden of English so that you can actually help us grow in new ways as we look to actually begin expanding, as we're picking up sponsorship and whatnot. We're also trying to bring on some new merch as well. You could check out our merch at our store. You can find that in either the card that's right up here or in the links down below. Follow us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram. And actually, we even have a TikTok now where we'll produce content as well. And, you know, we'd like to connect with you on social media, and we hope this is helpful, and we'll come back probably within a week to talk about exploring poems and also writing thesis statements. I've got a couple videos in my mind for how to do this here. And over the next few weeks, we will cover all of question 1 for AP Lit, and we'll just look into how to access poems in and of themselves, and we'll focus on Ozymandias. So I hope you all have a great one.